There's nothing like having your milieu skewered by somebody who knows it well. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a world I love in a way. So it's yeah, thank you. I mean, it's one of those things where in the States, I'm obviously not as familiar or familiar at all.
I do wonder if there's some different. I mean, it's funny because there's so much of the book. You recognize so much, and it's one of those books where you underline a lot just because it feels like it's nice to have somebody say it finally. There were other parts that were, yeah. I mean, it made me wonder about what's the difference, like where there are differences between the U.S. and the U.K., where there are things that are just curious about you, or like there's a woman, an Australian woman who's a poet I talked to a fair amount here, and I get the impression from her like there's certain things that are just like, oh, that's just Alice, but then there are other things that are like, oh, Australia's like there's some fucking weird
Yeah,
things
yeah,
about
yeah.
there, yeah.
Like, what's the filter? Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think they may be more earnest or credulous, but then we're more self-indulgent or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a difference. I mean, I would only be able to caricature it from my perspective. It seems to me, I mean, there's poetry wars in both places, right? And in Britain, they're very much concerned with, I don't know, questions of which tradition is the real tradition or something.
Hmm.
And it seems to me a little bit, in my limited experience of the States, that there's more hustling involved. Like there seems to be more like brand alignment sort of thinking around poetry. And I mean, Kent Johnson, I know he's a much despised figure in American poetry, but he has an interesting like visualization of this where he says since the kind of since creative writers, poets were given university jobs, he said like all of the stakes have gone out of like the various vying avant-gardes that American poetry had in the 20th century. And he describes it as the post-avance, where he's like, everything's kind of reduced to this horizon of everything's at the same distance. Everyone has tenure. Doesn't matter what kind of poet you are, or everyone doesn't, people don't, but
Right.
it's no reflection of your allegiances, whether you do or not, really. So it's almost this like undifferentiated landscape, which in some ways is kind of interesting, but in other ways it makes almost. I'm just going to dispose of my cat. It makes. I think it makes UK poetry almost look a bit. Can feel a bit nostalgic about these. Like there's actually still these sort of aesthetic differences, and they are disappearing. I think the internet is part of that. Like it's been a way of remapping it, and a lot of people who would have been on opposite sides and no longer are. It's sort of collapsed, that whole thing. But there's still a kind of tribalism, and there is still like definitely people at different extremes, and that does seem to still affect people's like chances of recognition and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. This would just be a sketch, and it might not even be very accurate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that does sound true. Like I think US and UK poets seem knowing in different ways. Like y'all are more skeptical, but we're more cynical. Like,
That's an interesting distinction. Yeah.
yeah, like you have these groups, these tribes in the book of poets, the scholastici and the grammatici.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and you say at one point that they're the only real difference you might notice from outside is that one writes long poems, one writes short poems, but they're still very like concerned with all of these traditional distinctions, and they're very proud and of these things, and that feels. I mean, I think that you're always sort of fighting the last war, but I think even like you're right that the professionalization of poetry flattened things, but then we're really kind of almost past that here. Like we're almost back to then just sort of like battle royale grand hustle where like only older people are tenured, and so everybody young is just sort of scrapping it out in a big
I see. Yeah.
war of all against all.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will introduce the book some. I'm curious though, and it's it's a question like any writer with literary ambitions sort of hates, but how, if you are forced to by your agent or your publisher do you even introduce this book? Because it's a book, it's a lot of fun. It's about the poetry world. It's also sort of a response to, you know, Gogol's Dead Souls, or at least it kind of borrows some of the you know, the devices of that book. But it's also kind of sci-fi, and it seems like there's some like social or like political satire, or, you know, maybe more like economic satire. How do you, if to the, you know, what we think of as like in America, the convention is like the uncle at Thanksgiving. What the hell is this book? Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. My guest this week is Sam Riviere, author of Dead Souls, a new novel out from Catapult Books. It's available now. I'll put a link in the show notes. In addition to being a novelist, Sam is also a pretty prolific poet, or at least, you know, prolific for his age. He's published 3 books of poetry and I think another book of prose. We had a great conversation. So Dead Souls is a just bananas book about poetry and sort of a dystopian future, and also kind of a reimagining of Gogol. I will just say, for the purposes of anybody listening to this podcast, if you have even a passing interest in poetry, and especially in the poetry world, this book is just extremely gratifying to read. It's just full of spot on rants and digressions about poets, poems, poetry, the poetry world in general. And you know, we talk about the book, but we also, you know, Sam's an honest to God poetry nerd. So we also talk about poetry, publishing, plagiarism, different schools of poetry, the avant-garde or the pseudo avant-garde. He's very knowledgeable and funny, and we had, I think, a lot of fun talking. He was very generous with the time, so it is a long conversation. I'm going to cut to that in just one moment. Real quick, one topic we strangely did not get to was poetry readings, which is one he writes about just deliciously in Dead Souls. His treatment of poetry readings is exactly as merciless and as precise as you might hope if you have ever been to a poetry reading or 600, as I have. So thank you for listening, and I think you're really going to enjoy this. Let's get to that conversation right now. This is Sam Riviere, author of Dead Souls. Before I read this, right before I read this book, I read an article you had on LitHub here. I don't know if it was, yeah. It was called "In Defense of Poetic Plagiarism," and it had kind of a two focuses, I guess. One being the poetry world. It was like UK, Australia, and the US were all had these poetry world plagiarism scandals in the the 2010s teens. And so I read your article, and initially I thought, oh, that seems like an overreaction. I then went back and read some of the, and like there was a lot more hysteria about that at the time than I'd remembered. Like people were really really worried about it, and there was that Ira Lightman guy who called himself a poetry sleuth, and like people, it did seem like there was some really crummy, weird behavior almost from everybody. Like there was like some like poetry snitches and poetry detectives, and it was just like a weird, it seemed like the pitchfork torch waving was excessive in some cases, but it was hard to find a case of somebody who had like borrowed in a truly transformative way. Like it did seem like they were all sort of just thieves, and you know,
question of bad faith, right?
Yeah, that is sort of how it felt. Like nobody was, maybe people were excessively punished, but nobody was punished sort of wrongly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think there was. I didn't really seek in that piece to. I originally called that piece "Sympathy for the Plagiarist," and they changed the title.
Yeah,
But
the title was not quite exactly what you were arguing.
yeah, I sort of, yeah, I went through a few like at the time when that happened, a few like stages of thinking about it. I mean, initially, of course, it's sort of like funny and horrible for the person who's been plagiarized, probably. Sort of funny for everyone else, or sort of not. I don't know. People get angry, but the more I thought about it, the more. I mean, I think partly it was a technology thing that it became a lot easier to find examples. I mean, who knows how widespread this was before it was easy to locate examples before digitization. Also, who knows whether the impulse somehow arises out of the technological ease of copying.
Yeah.
And a subsequent thought I had about this, and I completely agree with you that I think almost any case that I could think of or off the top of my head that I encountered, it either seemed to me, a question of deliberate deception, which is what plagiarism is, right? There has to be deception involved, otherwise it isn't plagiarism. And clearly with the express aim of gaining success doing that, gaining some kind of recognition. But there was so clearly like a flaw in this process, right? That to take a poem of one of your peers and submit it to the competition in which the members of that same community are also involved. Yeah. Like it was clearly going to happen that you would be caught. So who knows what's going on with that psychologically. There was one example in the US where I felt like the poet was a young woman. Yeah, and I felt like she'd accidentally, like she may have noted down some of the words, and it seemed like she'd sort of absorbed somehow some of these lines into her own poem, and it seemed like an honest mistake.
Yeah, she seemed to really believe that. I think it was more than just that one poem that she borrowed, but she seemed to genuinely believe that it was hers in some way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and okay, that brings me to my next stage of thought about this, which is that I think like part of me immediately sort of felt sympathy as well, because I feel like something that this illuminated for me is like I don't know if this is as much the case in the US, but in the UK, that the kind of poem that's going to win competitions, generally speaking, is like the poem of personal revelation or personal plight. And this is the link to the romantic thing about copyright, where there seems to be a deliberate stake on the idea that the lyric I in the poem is like continuous with the poet, the economic legal entity behind the poem who owns the poem, right? That they're unified, they're the same thing. And that is like a really new, relatively in the history of literature, a new idea. Like if you go back to ancient poetry, that wasn't really the case. Like there was obviously much more like distance or it wasn't legally codified. The I was possibly more like the I in a pop song or something, where you don't really believe that says this means that this really happened to her or whatever, right? Like we're able to suspend that assumption, right, in plenty of contexts. So it seems interesting to me that poetry is particularly keen to capitalize on that assumption, right? That's one thing. And then it seemed to me like, well, okay, why is it that this poetry of personal plight, personal revelation, like the personal experience as valid currency, or like the only currency that matters, like why is that the most foundational value in poetry? And then if your life is kind of not very interesting and you failed to have a car accident in which you kill a stag and see its entrails spilled all over the road, and you get to write a poem about it, like where are you going to source your valuable literature? And it seemed to me that like there was something I understood there, which was like the plagiarist sees someone else's poem, they connect with that poem, they sort of feel like they may as well have written, because in some way it is theirs, right? Like the experience isn't theirs, but I would argue that that's a false perception about what poetry is, that it isn't about the authenticity of someone's personal experience, it's about the language they use. And like there's this sort of interesting paradox where it seemed to me that the more a poem is like honed in on like an indivisibly personal expression, the more generic it is. Like it became quite easy to spot these kind of poems. And in fact, some of the UK poets who were caught plagiarizing were obviously very good at spotting which poems were going to win competitions, right?
Yeah.
And isn't that a weird standard? Where it's like, how different is that actually from writing one of those poems then? And if they, at what point, if they've changed enough, if the stag becomes a rabbit, if the mother becomes a grandfather, if the car becomes a motorbike, at what point does this stop being the same poem? I mean, I think that's a strange way to compose, of course, but like to me, this started to reveal something about like this slightly strange value system in contemporary poetry, which I think should be questioned probably. And taking these plagiarism cases as an example seemed like a way of doing that, I suppose, initially.
I mean, it reminds me of do you know, like in the US there's a cliche at this point, but I mean it's an accurate cliche when it comes to pitching screenplays, which is, you know, what is this screenplay I'm trying to sell you? It's X meets Y.
Yeah, sure.
X and Y are two already existing movies, and it's exactly the process you're describing. But that's, I mean, I think you're right. You have a passage where you say, you know, this scenario in which an expression of feeling or an account of experience is a commodity to be protected or seized is more revealing of problems in contemporary poetry itself. A conviction that personal plight is the only chip valid for trade in the cultural capital marketplace. I think there's, and this may be, I'm not sure if it's a distinction in between, like, I think like UK poetry is a longer and in some ways more mature tradition. Like it's older, it's further, but then I think American poetry is, in terms of capitalism, is further along. It's more advanced toward the you know, the age of like cannibalism and brush fires, you know.
Yeah, sure.
But it's funny, like you come to this conclusion at the end that it's like I reading this, you know, having like a lot of the same thoughts, came to almost the opposite conclusion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like you say, you talk about being born in the early 80s, which I was as well, and being kind of used to, you know, copy pasta and like sample culture and, you know, remixes and all this stuff. And that's so much internet art is, you know, sort of curation of one kind or another. And then you say, maybe one day there'll be no authors as we know them, only books, no poets, only poems, and literature will return to the anonymous commons where all creators are equally advantaged and equally obscure. And, you know, I'm, in a way, like I would sort of love that. Like I think of the, like Plato's Ion, where he actually makes no distinction at all between poets and reciters of poems. Like it's the same thing to him.
Yeah, sure. And well, this would be the communist version, right?
I mean, which sounds more appealing, in part because everybody's getting paid in some way. But the thing that I saw at least happening over here is that it's less and like it's personal plight, but even further, it's identity. It's like my own and identity, not even in the sense of like some, you know, authentic connection to a tradition or a history, but a brand. Really, it's about personal brand. And so like in a way, like I see poets who are really prominent now over here, there in very few cases is there at least with like viral Twitter poems, you can say like, oh, Maggie Smith, she's the one who wrote Good Bones. But in most cases, it's not even any given poem. It's just, oh, that's that identity, that's that brand. She's that, you know, like that's that person. And even the big fans of these people can hardly name a poem they've written. So it's like, in a way, like I see the future as being maybe I'm like fearing, maybe I'm just less optimistic than you. Like I'm fearing the ultra capitalist version where it's all poets, no poems, which you talk about at one point on Dead Souls.
There's the idea of the poet with no poems.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's far more likely. I would agree with that. I suppose what I was trying to get at is like, I think maybe not very well, but trying to sort of articulate like what the logic of going down one path where we like, it's all about owning ideas, right? And you just claim, and it's about fortifying, your brand. And really, you're very stringent about how you police who uses your work in that logic, right? You would be like, even if you have next to no poems, you'd be very pissed off if someone stole a line of your poetry because that's your property, right? Yeah, that would be like one way of looking at it. And I agree we're much closer to that. And I thought we're sort of trying to think like, what would the inverse be? Which would be like, it goes back to the sort of almost like more like oral culture, right? Where the idea of who originally wrote the story or who came up with the story that's being told to you at the fireside or whatever, it's the wrong question. Yeah. It's besides the point. The point is this a good recital of the thing? Is this a good telling of it? I suppose like then there would just be renditions of Yeah, we're much more remote from that version because we're very tied up with the idea of anything that is of value has to be owned by someone, right? I think I was trying to imagine, like, okay, what if there's this possibility exists? Then is that preferable to the alternative? I think it's harder for us to imagine because we're very. It's very hard to even. I mean, I know there've been experiments with this, with fake author names, like which multiple poets contribute to, or Renee Spalding, is it things like that? But they always seem like these are simply experiments. Like we're so invested in, and I can't personally get around understanding. Like if I read a poet I like, I see all of their work as like a body of work, which makes more sense and is more interesting the more of it you read, right? It's like it's the author function. Like you're interested in a poet, really. The poetry becomes more meaningful the more work you. It's not necessarily about the poet's biography, but it's certainly about the poet as a producer, as like an artistic power. And I don't really see a way around that other than like getting into traditions or like forms or something but maybe the other way around it would be to think of the author themselves as a form, right? That just as like a book is a form, like you could go zoom out again and really you could say that, okay, an author is a form, but there's nothing to say that a particular human being couldn't produce multiple authors or several people I mean, you know, it's the dispute about Shakespeare, like several people might not collaboratively produce a work that
right.
And even with something like a publishing house, you're getting towards something like that where like I think this is something that's not thought about much as well, is that the production of a poetry collection or book is a collaborative enterprise, right? Like there are lots of people involved in that process, but we're very used to just seeing that as like, oh, that's just like the nuts and bolts around the work. But of course everything is social on that level.
The closest example that I can think of is really like celebrity here is like you have an individual person who is sort of a going concern, and that's somebody, but like maybe the name has been changed, maybe the background is like, and you have a personal assistant, you have a manager, you have all these people managing this brand together. So they're really, that is a collective authorship, and the product is a persona.
Yeah. Do you remember Andrew WK?
Yeah, vaguely though. He was like his like party. He was like a hard partying rock star.
Yeah. So like a sort of I don't know, 2000s sort of rock guy. But there was a story about him that there was actually multiple people who were Andrew WK, right? There were people who performed as him, but there was no actual guy. There was a roster, and there was a massive like team around image production and advertising, and it was like a conceptual project. But I don't think that's actually true. But there's a character in the novel called Zelda Green who's like a kind of version of that. Yeah, who's like possibly like a kind of image consultancy experiment that has got out of control.
It's funny because it's so much the case that these brands are very carefully managed and refined. But what's also true is that it's still, at least over here, like the most devastating accusation you could make is of inauthenticity.
Yeah.
Like we do have a kind of an odd fetish, which is related, I guess, to that like personal brand, personal plight obsession. Like it's important that this be somehow genuinely you that we're in love with, or
it's the process of this person for real? Is it like with Kanye is quite a good example as well, like someone who's sort of been in a sort of this narrative of transformation and like continual like exceeding of the previous form or something, which I think is I mean, maybe you feel like you can tap it. I mean, what's the opposite to that? It's like the industry plant indie band or something, right? Where it's like being put together by like a
In Sync was famously one of those.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, or like even like I'm sure there's something more suspicious or sinister when like NSYNC are like obviously like a manufactured pop band, right? But like if it's like a band that presents as like authentic and like they all know each other from school and
right,
you know, they're like good guys and all the rest of it, and then it turns out that's all bullshit, and they were like come up with in like a board meeting and auditioned, then that would be a problem, right? I don't feel like I have a problem if the band is open about being manufactured, right?
Right.
And I wrote a thing about Kim Kardashian along these lines actually, which was like that
You
I
had
think.
a book that was like
Oh
bar
yeah,
like
it
on Kim
was not
Kardashian's
really about
hair.
her, but she became like quite an interesting emblem about thinking about this, and continues to be, I suppose. Where yeah, of course the image is manufactured, but you could very much say that the image is manufactured in the way that an artist manufactures their work, right? That the image is a project that is live and is continually, it's like a narrative that's continually changing. And to see it that way seemed to me to be like more interesting, like more rich or something.
Yeah, so this is where I felt in some ways confused by the book, because as I said, like there's so much that just feels like observational satire of the poetry world that just really struck home throughout. But there's also part of the conceit of the book is that people turn to poetry in a way that like poetry becomes actually a like a place where there's real money and real cultural influence, and people like wear poets on t-shirts or tote bags or things. And that I sort of like took as a given, in the same way that like I heard in a number of places, especially where you're talking about like industry mechanics. I heard echoes of David Foster Wallace. You even have a
Oh,
poem after
interesting.
him.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but I was then I kind of remained curious throughout, like what is being skewered or satired, like what's being pointed at by making poetry. There's something like the biggest stretch in the book is that poetry is like remunerative and like popular and influential, and like that's the part I kind of remained a little bit
Yeah,
befuddled
okay.
by.
Yeah, I don't really see the book as a satire as such, because I suppose satire has to have like, well,
Solution.
satire is like it's like I'm making fun of something by imitating it, right? Like I'm mocking it by imitating it, I suppose.
Or I mean, I would think like, or through, I think of it as like exaggeration, like slight exaggeration reveals existing foibles would be
Yeah,
how I think of
sure.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I would see it more as like yeah, like a comedic book that's not quite set in reality. Yeah, like how it became like I thought the novel really more as a way of like I could have written an essay about some of this stuff, but it
Right.
became more interesting to like imagine a way through it. So one of the questions would be like, what if poetry had this different sort of value? Like if we took the value that poetry is supposed to have, that I see as the like one of the problems perhaps in contemporary poetry, that like this tradition that which really emerges out of romanticism of owning your experience and your experience being irreducibly yours, where to me part of the appeal of poetry has always been like the escape from the self, or the fact that I'm not there. Like when
Yeah.
someone reads my poem, I'm not in the room, right? I like that element. I don't want to be there. I don't want them to know anything about me, right? So it's the kind of the opposite of making my identity like the, yeah, like the dollar sign or whatever.
Right.
I was just interested in thinking that through. So I'd be like, okay, what if like the value of poetry became very obviously it's like its value as like truth, if you like, its value as like personal truth of experience. And it's like, well, there would have to be a crisis in other forms of literary expression, which would be like, well, we're sick of the lies.
Right.
We want honesty now, right? And I suppose that's a genre like distinction that continues to puzzle me, which is like, I don't know when the split into fiction and non-fiction happened, right? But
Right.
ancient
Early novels all
civilization.
purported to be like real reports. They
Yeah,
all said they
totally.
were. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Like the novel wasn't. It wasn't this fully evolved fictional construct. Obviously, there were fictional stories before that, but for some reason, and I would have to tie this to like the capitalist marketplace, basically, that like people have to, once a text is like legally implicated, it can be implicated legally. It has to be clear what it is, right? It has to be clear whether it's supposed to be real or it's supposed to be veiled truth or it's supposed to be made up. It seems to me there's like holes in both categories, I guess, that like as soon as you're reading fiction, part of you is like, well, I guess some of this is true. It has to be. Some of this is like modeled on truth.
Yeah.
There's a germ of truth here. And when I'm reading nonfiction, I'm like, well, this sounds made up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like there's a problem with that category distinction is not, it's porous, right? It doesn't actually hold water, if you like.
Oh yeah. I mean, and in some ways that feels more like the kind of literary cultural scandals that feel of this moment. Like like your book is about people who get in trouble for not making something up, and here it feels like you get in trouble for making something. Like, oh, that's not your true story. Like that isn't really what happened to you. Whether it's the people lying about their identity or their background or the whatever else.
Yeah, part of that was like a thought experiment to reverse the situation. I mean, part of me wonders if whether there's something a little bit evasive about the way I do that in the novel, where like to me it seems like it is cultural stuff, but I've just kind of reversed the situation, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, what does come to mind is the at least my very limited understanding of NFTs. Like, which is in part of what is like baffling to me about the NFT thing, which although I guess maybe it makes perfect sense, is that the images that get sort of locked in and verified in this particular way are often like almost deliberately stupid, meaningless images. It's just like, it's almost just like content here. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just that it's authentic. And there's something of that to like, there's sort of dual tensions in the book where part of what matters is just that it's like content in whatever style or form or mode. But then there is this thing that comes up a few times that feels like the kind of the golden thread that's almost smothered, in the novel, to mix my metaphors, is that there's something of, so we should say like the central character, though not the narrator, is Solomon Weiss or Wiesa. Visa, is that how you say? Okay, I was wondering, yeah, because and you have a lot of like loaded name, person names, but I wasn't sure about the pronunciation. I was just going to say that to let people know about the book, it is the central character Solomon Visa, who's the two-time plagiarist, though as you say in different ways, and one of the things that happens when he kind of comes back into the poetry world, he doesn't write anything down. He recites seemingly spontaneously, though we learn later that he has literally and figuratively ingested the work of a bunch of obscure poets and then kind of reworked it. But one of the things that like seems to really strike people about it is that there is something, obviously there's some irony involved, but there's something genuinely, there's true poetry. And it seems like part of that is sort of ironic quotation marks around true, but also there does seem to be something like that touches the heart about this or touches home about this. And you even have him later talk about another, like loaded name, Phoebe Glass, a woman he ends up with, who, in addition to being like seemingly like a like a total monster online, like she seems like your worst nightmare on Twitter. She also is, he says, like she's a genuinely wonderful poet, and that it's hard, like even among like cynical, bitter poets, it's hard totally to resent a genuinely, like you actually still love the genuinely wonderful poets. It's the frauds and the liars that you hate. There is like somewhere in here, in this incredibly murky, like vicious world, there is somewhere somebody still loves poetry. It seems like.
Oh yeah, I'm glad that comes through, because I mean, I never know how obvious that is, because I suppose to me it seems like I obviously wouldn't have thought about this stuff that much if I didn't care about it.
Oh yeah, no, certainly.
I've been through the gears with it mentally, these questions, and like that is what drives the book. Actually, is like trying to think this stuff through, and then sort of taking various what if situations. I guess like what if someone just came up with poetry on the spot? Is it David Anton actually used to do that? I think, but I only found out about him afterwards. Strangely, I
don't even know.
There are quite a few examples of things in the book
that are kind of borrowed from life. I think I lost you again.
I just sort of made them up. I'm really sorry.
No. You said there are some different things in the book that are kind of imitations from life or from poetry.
Yes, and there are also a few things I came up with just as an example of like, oh yeah, what if someone could just invent poetry on the spot, and it just seems to be real poetry. And then someone drew my attention to someone who actually exists who does that. So there are a few things in the book where I made something up, and then someone was like, "Oh, you mean this person?" It feels like once you map out the possibilities here, there are people who have done it, of course.
Oh yeah, I mean, and there you have that, as a trope in the book that where the fake thing or the imitation thing becomes real over time. Like I mean, the central conceit of the Gogol book is that there's some basically like a tax loophole or something where he's buying the technical ownership of dead serfs in order to, there's some financial angle he's worked out. It's some, scam. So he's collecting all these non-existent people that he technically owns so that he can he can get some money from the government in some particular,
yeah, because if he has that many serfs, he must have land, right? But he has nothing.
Exactly, right. Yeah. So he invents sort of property out of thin air. And similarly in the book, I think you have Solomon Visa invents this tribe of fake followers, but then from that he ends up amassing even more, he seems to be popular, and out of that he becomes popular, even without any work attributed to him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which did feel very true to life. I was going to say, I was looking at a passage on 47, just because you had this wonderful long sort of like, at least for me, like agonizingly on the nose passage about the self-centeredness of young poets. I was trying to find a good passage for you to read, just to get some of the book in people's ears so they can sort of hear some of this, because it is all one. The whole book is one chapter, but it's also one paragraph. And you provide like what I initially took to be a table of contents at the beginning is just sort of like an index to help you get your bearings.
Certain characters appear. Yeah.
Right. But so whether it's that or there's another section that you like to read from to give somebody, give people kind of
what the page? Sorry.
I have this. I have I guess I don't know if this is the American edition.
Yeah. Okay. I have that to hand.
Yeah. I was thinking 47, starting with "It seemed to me."
Oh yeah. Okay. It seemed to me then that I had some precious, irreducible nugget lodged inside me, which required only the correct formula to be extracted and converted into works of poetry whose worth would be self-evident to all. I was in tireless search of this formula, and I shared my personal conviction with several other young men, there were 4 of us, who formed what we regarded as a miniature movement of the art. To us, our work was of obvious, immediate, and lasting significance, and if our efforts, in the form of poetry recitals and a series of self-produced publications, were met with indifference or uninterest, as not infrequently happened, we were genuinely puzzled. It was inconceivable to us that the value of our enterprises was not objectively apparent, and therefore equally impressive to anyone who encountered them. As well as wishing to inflict the products of our creative labours on our peers and indiscriminately on other members of the local artistic community, this was before any of us moved to the capital, we were possessive of our chosen art form in and of itself, and if any of us heard of another writer of verse who lived in the area, unless they were one of the few older poets we admired and had sought out as mentors, or was of a comparable age to us, or had had some precocious success, we would trawl the popular platforms of the day and, meeting in our private messaging group, demolish through sarcastic quotation and pedantic critique what we had found. My proprietorial instincts were keen enough that if I noticed someone in a cafe or on a train writing in a journal or on a laptop in a way that suggested their activity was literary, I became expert at spotting the clues. I was seized by a jealous rage and would attempt, if possible, to glimpse what they were working on. Sometimes the screen revealed a spreadsheet or the tablet showed a sketch, and my murderous anger would subside. But at other times I caught sight of what looked like a work of fiction, or worst of all, the stark lineaments of a poem, and dismissing it as unquestionably substandard work, or as irredeemably misguided work, I would return to my own projects with renewed anxiety and aggression. During this period, my opinions on poetry and art were entirely determined by my interactions with my friends, that is, the 3 other young men I lived with for 3 years in total, the 3 years of our undergraduate studies, during which time we spent every available moment discussing poetry and fiction and music and art. 3 years of basically relentless discussion while talking and drinking in the pubs of Bury, talking and drinking in the rooms of friends, talking and drinking as we walked between pubs and houses. And as we talked and drank to excess, rather than becoming incoherent, we became increasingly coherent. We became adept at anticipating and rebutting one another's opinions, at attuning ourselves towards or against one another's perspectives. It then goes on into quite a long-winded
close description of what it's like to have these sort of solipsistic arguments and discussions among friends. Yeah, I mean, and as I said, like it really sort of stung in its familiarity for me. Though I tend to kind of think that it's a pretty merciless depiction of that kind of self-congratulatory relationship among a small group of friends. I do kind of feel like you were talking earlier about these small communities. I feel like the kind of small groups of friends in poetry, like as sort of mutually masturbatory as they can be, are also like one of the places where there is at least there's some reference still to somebody's enjoyment of something, which comes up elsewhere in the book. Like one of my kind of personal obsessions with the contemporary poetry world is the removal from anyone's enjoyment, like the disregard of any audience. And so like here, at least there's like, well, at least like among these three people, we have some sense of like liking something.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel, I mean, that's pretty true to life for me as well, that experience with, there's obviously an element of short-sightedness to that activity, which in retrospect, you can sort of see that you're taking everything incredibly seriously and you think everything's incredibly important. But then if no one thinks it's important, then it isn't. And I do feel some real affection towards those years. Like I wouldn't, and it's you know, when you read about the lives of poets or whatever, they all seem to have done something like this. Like everyone has a period of intense activity with other poets, probably, where you debate every line break and you know, you really tell people what you think. And yeah, I think it does seem to me as well, and I don't know whether this is just that I'm more removed from that situation now, and I don't really workshop or anything anymore.
Right.
But it does seem to me that that's kind of disappeared slightly. That there doesn't seem to be the same, at the risk of sounding cantankerous, but like I do feel, and I feel sympathetic to what you just said, that it seems to me that it's not really about whether you enjoy the poem anymore.
Right.
And like it's more about whether you agree with it or whether it hits you or whatever. And it's like, well, actually, what about pleasure? And like for me, that was always the most important thing. It still is with poetry. And maybe that's partly why I seem to have increasingly lost interest in contemporary poetry. That or at least like I'm very selective.
Right.
It seems to me that like if it's not going to like deliver on that level, I'm really not that. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm really not that interested. If it doesn't like connect with me on that level, and like I'm sure that's a loaded statement and comes with a load of like expectations that could be critiqued. But that's the tradition I sort of got into, and the one that still matters to me. I can see that there's problems with that as well, but I guess to me I feel quite remote from the what seem like the primary concerns of contemporary poetry now. Like I obviously there's a social activism side which I care about.
Sure.
But it does seem to me that's isn't it? To me, it's always been the question that what's the question that art can do that like politics can't do.
Right. You know? Well, I mean,
it seems to me a mistake to ask. Again, this is just my opinion, but to ask art to do the work of like activism or politics. I mean, there's going to be instances where a poem gives you a revelation that does affect your point of view and does affect your assumptions, and that's to the good. But I don't think that can be the. No, I don't know. I don't really want to maybe.
No, I mean, I'll say for I tend to find that the insistence on blending art with politics or activism tends to be the result tends to be kind of negligence on both counts. Like it's not great politics and it's not great art either. Like it does. I do tend to think that like there's as navel gazing and self-indulgent as like three guys or four guys living together talking about poetry every day can be. It's for good or ill, something is developed in that closed off, self-absorbed world that can't, whether that still happens or not, it wouldn't happen in the same way if it were all happening in public online, right? Like if it were constantly referring back to a public conversation, it would be, whether that's a better or worse thing, it would be a different thing.
I think we're in a different age. When I in a way feel happy that I, as someone who values privacy, and I don't think the like strip lighting of an internet environment is beneficial to like your little seedling of poetic experimentation. So for me, I think like there was a much more subcultural and hothouse kind of atmosphere around people's early forays into poetry, going to readings and meeting poets, and that all seemed to take place in a completely different atmosphere to the one that exists now around people's first exposure to getting their work seen. And I can't say I'm envious of the situation for young poets now. I think it's incredibly highly pressurized, and it becomes incredibly difficult to see where you fit into this, or whether there's any reason to insert yourself into that discourse, and whether there's any notable reward in doing so. Like I think it does exist, but I think you do need your gang. You do need to be maybe even geographically, or if not, like in non-public online spaces, for that to ferment and like become something, rather than just like fucking blasting it with attention. And then it tends to just like shatter or shrivel or something. It's often too early for that, I think, and it's a big ask for someone who's written a few poems to suddenly, hundreds of people are reading their poem on their Twitter account or whatever. That seems that seems like an uncomfortable lurch to me into something that's a little too intense. Because I think I first published poems in magazines with a circulation in the low hundreds.
Right.
I mean, who knows who actually reads those magazines?
Sure, right, yeah. The question is like, what's the proportion of like readers among, because at least
sure, but I don't know who reads them. And
right, yeah.
I suspect hardly anyone. But
I was a little bit curious, just, and this may be just like a UK thing. Like you have the town where these guys go to college is Bury, Bury.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know if that's a real place, but it obviously has a strong, other suggestion to it.
It stands in for Norwich, which is where I went to university. But I didn't want to make it. It's what the town I'm referring to is called Bury St Edmunds, which is not far away from Norwich.
Sure.
But it's not known as a university town, really. So it's a kind of semi-fictional creation.
Right. And I mean, and obviously it picks up on the kind of the theme throughout of death and dead souls. It's Bury, it's like they're
interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. Yeah.
Because you also elsewhere you have literally the city of Dis, which is like from Dante's Inferno. Like
it's also a real place.
Oh, there is a Dis?
Yeah. Dis is, I think Dis in Dante is with one S, right? And then,
it is one S.
In Norfolk, there's a city called Dis, or a town, which is just coincidentally, like, it was kind of too good to pass up, I suppose.
Yeah. So, part of what may be curious, though, because there is such a focus at some points in the novel on the capital, and I know culture in the UK is much more sort of perfectly centralized. We have kind of a few cultural capitals here, but we also just have a whole lot more space in between.
Yeah.
But then at least my impression is that there's a similar kind of bottleneck of culture when it comes to Oxford and Cambridge, and this is sort of pointedly not that. So I wondered, is that like the guy, both the narrator who's talking about being in Bury and Solomon Visa, who talks about being in Dis, they do end up in the capital. Like, it seems like sort of everybody who participates in the cultures there initially, but they're not Oxbridge guys. Is that meaningful there, or am I just being a tourist?
Yes, it is. Because I think, you might some people obviously go to university in Oxford or Cambridge, but I wouldn't say that they're cultural hubs other than in an educational.
Right. No, but it seems like there's a strong, like, if you hear of somebody who is from the UK, there's like, I feel like at least from here, who's like an active participant in the culture. It feels like there's a very high percentage chance that person went to Oxford or Cambridge. Interesting.
Yeah. That, I mean, certainly in the media, publishing especially, that's true. So the sort of shadow versions of that are the scholastici and the grammatici that come in later. You get they're kind of a very caricatured version of the Cambridge school, and a possible antagonistic tradition that doesn't exactly exist.
Right.
But Cambridge
fake rivals.
Yeah, Cambridge is certainly like a nexus of a certain type of poetic tradition, a sort of modernism after pound kind of thing,
Right.
which is quite forbidding from the outside. And then Oxford isn't really the center of any definable poetry tradition, but it seemed tempting just to imply that there could be another tradition there that was very similar, but in opposition to it.
Yeah, I mean, and those kind of rivalries.
Yeah.
So I was saying those kind of rivalries here as there, I think, become really good ways to maintain supremacy. It's like you're picking one or the other rather than thinking of anybody else.
Yeah, totally. No, it's exactly the logic, right? And in fact, there would be a tradition out of Oxford which would be like a less academic kind of poetry, but it's not codified and formalized in the same way that it is in Cambridge. I mean, in Cambridge, the situation, I mean, perhaps less so now, but really was of acolytes and a school that was quite, ironically enough, an incredibly a tradition incredibly invested in Marxism, and something that I could never quite take seriously.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah. There's certainly like a lot of elitist Marxism over here, or sort of. I think of that as like almost the difference between Marxism and the Marxist criticism, or like academic Marxism, Marxist flavor or brand.
Yeah, right. Yeah. As a USP for your poetry, almost.
So I did a kind of a 2-man book club, reading this with a guy who does stuff on the podcast with these, and a point he was sort of particularly curious about that I was as well. There's, it is a, you're saying it's not a satire, however you want to categorize it. It certainly has it has a very sharp tongue as a novel, but there are places where there feels like some genuine humanity. And one of those is this kind of, faint, but distinct theme throughout of like some genuine love for poetry, some genuine belief in poetry. And then the other one is this, or one other that Brian was really curious about, is this other story of these two women, and particularly of the relationships that these women have with some of the young men in the novel. And there's, the narrator has an affair with this young woman almost to spite his buddy who has a crush on her. And ends up sort of treats her sort of in a crummy way, and then she ends up going off to date a poet after that. We learn later that she's this kind of tragic figure. She's sort of sunny and wonderful, and everybody loves her, and she just gets treated worse and worse and worse, to the point of being destroyed, and then being kind of she becomes the banner waved by her friend, who's we're told the kind of the wonderful poet. But it was, apart from just being kind of a moving story within this larger cultural, panorama. How do you think about the relationship between that? Like, again, it was sort of like there's the stuff about the poetry world. There's the kind of the larger cultural, and again, like that, you do have the activism, you do have kind of this economic kind of vision of things. But what role does this play in all that? Because it felt like it was interesting and it was moving, but I wasn't sure how it added, where it came into the bigger picture.
I think it's partly comes of wanting to, in some way, indicate the limits of the narrator's authority, and a sense of some place where his knowledge drops away. That the world of the book exists beyond what he can see and understand. And also that I think the idea that there are consequences that are sometimes more severe and serious than one imagines from one's actions. And this again seemed to be, perhaps it doesn't in a very direct way tie into the plagiarism idea, but I suppose there is the sense of like, this is a story, perhaps what it relates to, and in some ways I see it as the heart of the book, the Jessica Lake narrative. It's
the most moving part, yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's kind of the core of it in a way, because it is the reason that the Solomon Visa character is talking. It's what's powering his monologue, which lasts most of the book. And it emerges as like the motive for why he's talking to the narrator.
as well as like the narrator's like culpability in all of this.
Yeah, exactly. That the narrator is not above. That seems to me something important. That he seems like a spectator who's very much got nothing at stake in particular. He's made himself aloof and in some ways untouchable in the situation he occupies. He has a position of relative privilege, and he's able to exert his preferences and his, do what he wants basically. And then I wanted that it was important to me that there was a sense that he was implicated. His actions make him a participant in the world he's in, and that this catches up with him in some way or another. There's a point that the narrator or Solomon Visa makes about when you're the person who tells a story, you become part of that story. Like you become a participant in the story. And that there's a sort of contagiousness to stories that like once you've been the recipient of a story, you sort of have a responsibility, and you are sort of in some way infected by that story. Going back to the oral tradition at the fireside or whatever, in a way you are virally passing on a narrative, and there may be meanings in that narrative that you're not completely aware of, right? There may be, like in most folk tales, there's some kind of warning or value being asserted in that tale, right? That you might not exactly recognize, but you will nonetheless become a carrier of that story, a bit like of a virus or something.
Right. No, I mean, because there is a little bit of a feeling, and like really, Brian, I think one of the ways he formulated the question was like, well, is this is like is poetry juxtaposed against the story of this woman's ruined life because to show that poetry is like silly and trivial, or to show that it's important? Because in some ways it feels like you get to this and it's like they're like Zen parables where you listen to the story and then
yes,
3/4 of the way through you're like, oh, actually none of that matters. This is the thing that really matters.
Well, I think there's an ambiguity there for me. I mean, there's a scene early on where the Jessica Lake character, this character we're talking about, attends a poetry reading, and it turns out she's the only person who really understood the poem, while everyone else sort of pretended to understand it.
Yeah.
So I feel like also what the vehicle for Jessica Lake's, the consequences of everyone's behavior and the Jessica Lake character, the vehicle for that information reaching you it comes through the literary form, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to force that one way or the other, but I would say there's definitely ambiguity about what the relationship of art to, let's say, suffering or real life consequences of the behavior of the artist. And then that seems to me like a fatal ambiguity. Like it's not one that can be resolved, but it's one that sort of haunts poetry in a way, right? Like the stakes, nonetheless, we can all say poetry is trivial and it doesn't matter, but nonetheless, there are real life situations. The version I have in the novel is the prisoner in the cage who has memorized this long poem.
Right.
There are nonetheless plenty. I mean, you might think of Osip Mandelstam's widow who memorized his work, but there are situations where the real life consequences or undertakings people made in the name of poetry were extraordinary, right?
Right.
And that therefore there's a value there that can't be completely dismissed as it's like a load of ego worship and nonsense.
Right.
Where it's like there are scenarios where that becomes clear, right? But those are not easy to come by in our day-to-day existences in the kind of culture we live in, right?
No, right.
Poetry is very rarely tested on that level anymore in the West.
Yeah. Louise Gluck has a line in one of her books of Theories and Proofs, I think, where she says like, no first world poet is brave. Like there are brave poets, but like this is not like telling about your sad childhood is not brave.
No.
Yeah, the prisoner in the cage.
Or you might even say subversive, right? I don't know if it's possible for a poet from the advent of the internet possibly to be subversive, right?
Well, which is a like you mentioned earlier that you oppose competition in poetry, and you don't like to think about poetry being about individual poets gaining notoriety or success.
Well, I do enjoy thinking about it, but I don't advocate it.
Well, right, but then it's I mean it almost is I mean, and again, like I think the economy of poetry may be a little bit different there than here, but like you can advocate that, but you're advocating it as someone who's got a teaching job and has published books and is, you know, like it's sort of hard to, you know, to do that.
Or it's easy to do it, right?
Right, yeah, or it's easy to do it from one position rather than another. So I did like now that I think of it, I did, looking back at it in the Jessica Lake story, you're right that she's the one who has the genuine response to this poem at this poetry reading, which is full of people pretending to understand things or pretending to you know, be knowing. So she has this genuine response to this genuine poem, but then the guy who wrote the poem, whom she ends up, you know, she ends up dating, is a total piece of shit to her. And so like the there is there, I think, something that rings true about whatever like genuine humanity and soulfulness and morality may come through in poetry. It's not, it has very little to do with the conduct of the poet in his life.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, maybe that is the thing that is unique about poetry, or seems to make it worth returning to always, is that like you don't know with a poem, right? Yeah. It's like the poem, it's possible to encounter a poem that seems to know more than it possibly could know when it was written, right? It's possible for a poem to somehow anticipate things that the poet couldn't have anticipated. Yeah. There's somehow this like hidden capacity in it somehow, where it seems to be able to mean more than it could have possibly be intended to mean in certain situations. And I very rarely encounter that in fiction. It feels like almost always like this has been woven in with a more, I feel like it's almost in an involuntary way a poem can mean something, right? And
yeah.
And it's not really, or you can even write a poem and then years later be like, oh, I didn't even know what that poem was about when I wrote it.
Some of that has to be like the spareness of it. Like I think like part of what makes like the like in the, you know, old Greek stories, that Apollo's you know, oracular pronouncements, part of what makes them so powerful is that they lack all context. So that like, it's only later, it's only after the fact that you can see what they mean. And poetry feels a little like it's so stripped down that it can acquire context that the poet didn't have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And of course it reflects back an image of its reader in that sense, you know, like the
right.
Like the sonnets can mean something different to us than they meant to the Victorians, because they're big and complicated, but there's enough gaps in them, if you like, or enough absence of context for them to sort of like reflect something different back every time. And that does seem like an amazing thing in a way.
I do think there's something about that to I mean, something about that's poetry. Something about it is art, though, because like there was a story here in the New Yorker a while ago, maybe a year or so ago, kind of it was sort of a takedown of Flannery O'Connor. I don't know if you know her.
I know of her. I don't know.
Yeah, she's a short story. I mean, she's I think an extremely influential and beloved short story writer here. The article was sort of about like, oh, well, she was really a lot more racist than people knew, because her stories often deal with race. And I think like hearing in the article again felt like so much like literary journalism or criticism here. It felt like primarily a vehicle for promoting the author of the article, but but like it both, like in recounting some anecdotes of her, you know, saying shitty things or acting in a crummy way, I felt like, well, I believe that. I believe that she could be small-minded. I believe that she had, you know, blinders. But what's also true is that there is a clearer moral vision in her work than maybe she had in her life. And I think
that's interesting.
Like people, I think there's a way in which art can be truer and more right than the artist, you know, has access to. Like when you write really well, I think you're always writing a little bit beyond your own capacity as a person. Or at least which is part of what I think is like the virtue of the tradition here, like in a like an Eliadic sense. So I'm curious because it is something I felt my wife and I, you know, met in grad school for poetry, and she's totally abandoned poetry. I feel like there is a real disillusionment among a lot of poets. I think often it's people our age. I'm curious, you said, you know, you've published a few books, I mean, poems that like relatively recently, I mean, or at least within the last 9 years, you've published like three 2 or 3
Yeah, I
books.
published a book last year.
Yeah. So, but you just said earlier that and then you wrote well, I mean, I guess you're writing a novel now, but you also said you kind of lost interest in contemporary poetry. How much, or how do you mean that?
Not across the board.
Right.
I mean, I used to be a real poetry guy, like I would read all the magazines. I would be
A contemporary poetry guy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's also like, that also is a thing that you go through. Sure. Like when you get serious about poetry or whatever, there's a point where you just have to absorb a load of stuff, and then there's another phase where like you start to have more of a sense of what you like and what you don't like. And I would try with everything, because part of me felt like if it was poetry, it was interesting enough for me to read. And then slowly I became more confident, and this was related to me not feeling like I didn't have to assert I could assert a preference, but I wouldn't assert like an objective value. So I'd be like, for me, I prefer this. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with reading poetry of the Cambridge School, which I know lots of people like, but for me, I've never got anything out of it. Yeah. Right. And like, I personally don't really click with the romantic poets, but I like Roman poetry. So it's like starting to be like, okay, there's certain things I feel like I can tune into, and that are like, for me, are thought-provoking, and they lead me further in. They lead my thinking in further than other things, and I feel like I tune into them better. So then it becomes about prioritizing that. And I guess I do read contemporary poetry, but I read mainly poetry in translation at the moment, European poetry, and a handful of like contemporary poets who I continue to really love. I also have a small press, so I mean, I publish quite a lot. Right, yeah. Too. So I mean, I do read a lot of it, but I would say I've become a bit more. I would say that the percentage of poetry that I like out of what I encounter is very low. It's under 10% or something. Like most of it, I find it too obvious what it is, like what tradition it's in, like what, and I feel like a bit of an arsehole saying this, but like I feel like it's more about like you read something and you're like, okay, I'm interested. Now I would like to know more. And then you begin a journey with a poet, right? Like you start to get into them. But quite often I read something and it's very obvious what it is. Yeah, it's like there's no mystery or something. It's like I can see what this is, and like it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't feel I need to go any further, right? There's there's an interview with a Romanian poet, Monk, which I read about 10 years ago, but really made a big impression on me, where he said when you read a poem that's a real poem, and I would take that as subjectively as imaginable, it's a problem, because you have to change everything you think. Like it hurts you. It's like, okay, now I have to think, now I have to deal with this. So he's like, I dread it. I dread to encounter a real poem, but I also love it, because but I completely relate to that. There's poets, when I first read them, I was like, oh, okay, I have to rethink things now, because this changes things for me. Yeah. And that can be a kind of like experience that can totally, I don't want to feel like was dismissing political or politicized poetry out of hand, because that can certainly be a reappraisal that impacts you on that level. But I think perhaps it's something about a poem that is too obviously setting out to have that effect. That is, and for every, however I phrase this, there'll be an example that doesn't. Of course, right. So I would just like to couch this with like plenty of caveats and reservations, I guess. But, right. Yeah. But you continue to be an avid reader, right, of poetry, but like I feel like more remote from it as like a cultural sphere or something. It's funny that what you're talking about, a real poem changes things. I think that maybe in so far as there is sort of a not even consensus, but like something remotely approaching a consensus in American poetry, there's a premium on the disruptive aspect of sort of original or real or good or great poetry, that like we're very aware that like it ought to shake things up, it ought to change things. But I think there's far less emphasis on
like line by line, beauty or
I see what you're saying.
like indelibleness, and then there's almost no emphasis on like a larger coherent vision, or like
Yeah,
like it's all disruption. No,
sure.
yeah,
If everyone's disruptive, then there's nothing to disrupt.
right, which is how.
And I think that quite quickly becomes a mode that it needs an enemy, right? It needs like it needs a. And I think there was a point in recent times, under 10 years ago, where that there's been a shift, culturally speaking, in the last decade, where there's been a reevaluation of whether became very transparent that we were supposed to be in a situation where everything was equal. It wasn't equal for everyone.
Yeah, there's a poem. I was thinking there's a poem in a recent issue of Poetry called "Fuck Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying," and I think that that's one strain of a backlash to
And I think that these interventions at times are essential and have to happen, and that's for a whole load of people, that's a reinvigoration of the poetic practice, right? And that's great. But I think that there's always a continuum, right? There's always also what's something being carried over, and disruption is always necessary, but at the same time, if disruption is the only currency, then very quickly we're going to get to a situation where it's like the disruption will become disruption of this new political awareness, right? Which will be like, actually, aren't we all fed up with having to do that now? And will there be like a resurgence of some like really un-PC writing or something? I don't know. I feel like disruption isn't in itself interesting.
No,
it's like it's about what it's doing, and I think there have been really vital interventions in the past decade on that level that have shaken things up and have also made poetry a more open environment, which I think is good. I mean, I know Don Scher came into a lot of, I don't know how public we can go with this on the podcast, but I know
please, yeah.
He basically got into quite a lot of trouble, and there was there was not a lot of love for Don Scher on the internet at a certain time. But I mean, I was like, people have short memories, because when Don Scher took over, Poetry Magazine was a very staid, really very traditional poetry magazine. I mean, it was the Christian Wyman era, right? And that was not a magazine where any poet I'm with American poetry. I'm like a fan of the New York school. That was my way in, and then but it was not. It seemed like a sort of new formalism type deal, and I had a hard time. I mean, you couldn't get hold of it over here anyway. But it was when it went online, you could get it online.
Yeah.
But I mean, that seemed like a fairly stiff poetry publication. And Don Scher did really open it up, and he did numerous features on UK poetry. He really did shake things up. And then it's like suddenly he's not enough of it. He became the new thing to be disturbed.
Oh yeah. I had plenty of
that turnover will just get quicker and quicker, and it'll end up quite confusing for everyone. And I think at this point it becomes like a socially and socially, mentally, and emotionally absorbing scenario, which has really nothing to do with poetry. That is about staying abreast of the latest thing poets are mad about, and it seems like that isn't anything. That's nothing to do with writing poetry, in my opinion, anymore. It's about fueling the discourse, and sadly, the technology that powers this is not neutral, and it's worked out that negative emotion is the best fuel. So I mean, I'm not particularly interested in going into that whirlpool.
No. I mean, and why would you be? Do you think is this? Do you find yourself? Because I know this has been the case for I mean, me to some extent, and for a lot of poets I know, that have you been? You just published a novel, but are you? Is that a larger turn for you? Do you think towards fiction?
No, I have another poetry book that is ready. I might write more fiction. I don't know right now. I don't really think about that. Things emerge, and it will just be what next when that happens. But I finished a poetry manuscript, so I do have another poetry book. But I suppose, and I think I would also say, would say there's an element of possibly the age I am. I'm 40, so like, of like, I think maybe it's normal to feel like you're not you're not particularly in step with what like the poets in their early 20s are doing right now.
Yeah.
That's probably as it should be. Like so I don't worry about that. And I think also when you get into that, you know, the sort of you're no longer like a newcomer to the situation. I think it seems quite natural to sort of become a little bit distant from it and a little bit more remote. And that's actually where you start to get more deeply into it too, right? Like you start to become more self-sustaining as a writer or whatever, and or it can work that way.
Yeah. And you
get sort of, you go further, then, and that's not really, that stops becoming about your immediate social situation. It's not really, when you start out, that is everything. Like the people you know through poetry, and like we were talking about with that passage, they're the be all and end all of whether you've written a poem or not, you know. So, or whether you will or whether you won't. So that's no longer the preeminent concern, right? It's like, I imagine I'll continue to write, but it's like that's not really something that's going to be determined by my peer group anymore. I'm lucky in that I've published some stuff, and hopefully I'll be able to publish stuff in the future. So, I mean, you know, that seems fine to be recognized that these things are probably, I shouldn't probably worry about that stuff, and neither is it really my place to get involved in it on that level.
I have wondered about, like, in some ways poetry feels to me like lyric poetry, short poetry, you know, lyric poetry feels to me like a young man's game and an old man's game. Like it's like it feels like middle-aged. Maybe there's something about like certain forms that appeal to different phases in life. And there's something like more muddled and like maybe substantial, but also less crystalline about fiction, or, you know.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've thought about that. There's some poets who I started off really liking, British poets. There was certainly a sense of diminishing returns, right? Their first, like, these would be poets now pretty old.
Sure.
There was a certainly sense that their first book fine, the second book they're starting to, you know, they're probably third book's their best book or something.
Sure.
Fourth book, okay. Fifth book, who cares?
Yeah.
You know, some people have written 10 books, and it seems like that's a lot of poetry.
Oh,
like, who really needs 10 books? Have you read The Anthologist by Nicholson Baker? There's a really funny part in that where he says 3 books is enough. Like,
it is.
Unless you're like the sort of poet, like a John Ashbery style poet who like does actually seem to have phases that are quite distinct from each other. There's really no reason for you to write more than 3 books of poetry. And
I think he might have overdone it a little too. But
yeah, sure.
Because for him it wasn't like 10 books; it was like 27 books.
Yeah, sure.
It's insane.
You're dealing with a body of work which is expansive, and yeah, I mean, for some poets it seems like that's just how they are. That's fine. I feel like there also seemed to be a question with the lyric poem, which I felt like you were suggesting, which there was a poet I really liked, Ian Hamilton, who's dead. He wrote 1 book of poems, like maybe 2 books, but about 70 poems in total, very short, which were a big discovery for me in my early 20s. But really, he only wrote when life meant that he had to write, i.e. when he was in severe emotional crisis.
Right.
So it's like, in a weird way, the logic would be that if you manage to sort out your problems, like writing would just be a symptom of your mental strife, right? So in an ideal world, you would stop writing poems eventually because you would no longer be in emotional crisis all the time.
Yeah, or you come in and out of it. Yeah, like there'd be phases where you.
Yeah, that seems to me like a strange way of thinking about art, right? I can't think of another art form where it's like, well, it's fine to write a poem if you're like, it's either that or like jump off a bridge. But like, I can't think of another art form where the intensity of your personal like mental health problems is related to your output so directly, right? And that seems like not a desirable way of setting up your writing, like of being a writer. It's like, well, if I write, I mean, Berryman almost seemed to like seek out like emotional turmoil.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
Productive, and that seems like a completely like a fallacy, right?
No,
Like a
right. Yeah. I think Oscar Wilde has a line about like the best poets he knows are the most boring people. And vice
right,
versa.
or that like there would certainly be like what the reason I like Ashby as an example is that it seems to be nothing to do with him, whether he writes poems or not.
Oh
Like,
yeah. Yeah.
it's just something he does, and he doesn't see. I mean, I like that he. I mean, this shocked me as a 25-year-old poet that he said like I don't. He didn't remember any of them even.
Right.
Like someone quotes one, he's like has no idea if that's him or not. It's not just that there's so much of them; he literally doesn't care. Like, but that to me presented like a totally different like the sort of British tradition that I'd grown up with, which was the post-movement tradition, like out of Philip Larkin and people like that.
Yeah.
There's really a poetry of like personal, immediate crisis, right? Or hard-won personal reflection, right?
Yeah.
Always a personal poetry, always a poetry which is pretty much all the chips are staked on this is my life and it's me in the poem, right? There are other traditions of British poetry, but that was that one. And to me, it was incredibly refreshing and liberating to discover a tradition that was nothing to do with that. That was like, it wasn't diminishing returns as you get older because you have to maintain this pitch of like intensity in your own life. It was like, no, you might be a poet in the way a painter is a painter or a musician is a musician, where it's something that you do. And it's a well that you can go back to, or a river that you're always near, or something. And it's like that sort of seemed like a much more, to me, intuitively, I connected with that way of thinking about it a lot more.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think everything you're saying makes perfect sense in terms of like craft and like and analogies to other arts. But it does feel like with poetry, there's maybe partly because it has a different kind of shelf life than other poems or than other art forms, and because it's like the least remunerative and like least popularly accessible. Like there's so with an artist, there's such a thing as like a journeyman artist. Like, I mean, there's no like journeyman versifier, like, unless you're sort of like cranking out verses for, I mean, I don't know, like Hallmark. I mean, I don't know what you would.
Yeah.
Not even in a sarcastic way, but like, I'm not sure what it would be that you'd like, where you'd be like, well, let me paint, let me do a mural on this wall. Like, otherwise it feels like there's some, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I once got approached by a company to write like commission poems. So like you'd get like a worksheet, which would be like, okay, it's like my nephew's bar mitzvah. And like, we need, we need and this is what he likes. He likes go-karts, and and you'd have to write a poem. I mean, I didn't do it, but these things do exist, but you have to say this is pretty far removed from what we're talking about, I suppose.
Right. Well, no, but I think like there is some version of that with most art forms, and I don't know, like poetry, of course, like historically has meant a lot of different things. Like the way at least we think about poetry now, it feels like it may not be it may be partly because it's not really a healthy art. Like it's not an art form in good health right now. But like that, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious if you like, as somebody who is publishing, you're not publishing a book a year, but you're publishing a fair number of books. And as you say, like you think of it in terms of like a more sort of stable craft or interest that you can return to in a like a sane, regular way. What effect do you want your poems to have? Like, what do you aim to do with them, I guess?
I think there's a few things. The health of poetry, I think, is how do you measure that is interesting, because I would say that in terms of readers, it's never been as healthy. The amount of people who actually,
in terms of quantity.
Yeah, in terms of quantity of readers, and in terms of the amount of people involved in it. I guess I have a few like not necessarily harmonious feelings about this, which is like one would be like, if there's lots of poets, then there's lots of poetry readers, and maybe there's nothing wrong with that. I kind of resist the idea that the mantle of poet can only fall to a certain amount of people, and
Sure.
that's quite opposite to how I think about it.
You have a passage in Dead Souls. You say an argument made by some at that time was that the more writing, the better for the culture in general. That the more writers equaled more readers. That more writing equaled a healthy writing culture. Yeah.
So that's one take on it, and then the narrator says he violently rejects that. Okay. Who knows how we measure the health of it? I would say it's in a phase, and poetry is like always in a phase, and it's always connected. Poetry is always. It's not been this eternal, stable art. It's always connected to technology and society, and who's allowed to practice poetry, and who has the means to do so, who has the time to do so, who has the ear of the person who gets your poetry out there.
And you talk in a really frank way in this book about both like connections and money in a way that people do not talk about very often.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you need time to write poetry. I mean, and actually, it's a complicated history because there's also an oral tradition of poetry, which we shouldn't write out of the equation. But, in Europe in the, centuries before the 20th century, really, you had to, if you were literate, you were already one of the few. It wasn't a popular art form. There were obviously folk traditions of song and so on, but when we're thinking about the literary tradition of poetry, it's almost exclusively the domain of the sort of hyper privileged. Another thing that's really changed is you can access poetry now, right? When I started, the internet was very early phases. When I started to get into poetry, there was no Facebook. There was like, where I got poetry was secondhand bookshops.
No, me too.
What was in there just depended on who was dead, who had died, and their books then remained, right, or whatever you want to call it. So I was really finding poetry that had been published in Britain in the 80s and 90s, which was like a really narrow band of what's out there, and stuff that is really no one talks about anymore, right? So, but I couldn't read John Ashbery. You can, unless I had 20 quid to spend on an imported book, which I didn't. You would never find that kind of thing in a secondhand bookshop. None of it was online. You could go to a library, but they wouldn't have it unless you were at a university. If you weren't at an institution, I mean, and that's just saying like big names of like American poetry, but you really couldn't read that sort of stuff. So that's changed, and that's, I think, great. Like, that's an amazing thing. You can basically read anything you like. So we're in a like a strange moment historically, in that people write more now than they've ever written. Everyone writes every day. I mean, that's the first time that's ever been the case. Sorry, what's the question? What's my assessment of the poetry?
Oh, well, no, I mean, I'm curious, given your...
So yeah, this idea of going back to it, like, I wouldn't describe it as like a craft, in the sense that, like, I also like to make books and pamphlets, like with paper, and that's a craft. Like, you learn how to do it, you get better, you get more polished your production. I don't see poetry like that, because one day I might write a poem. It might be good, it might not be. It has whether it's good or not has no bearing on how many poems I've written before. Like, it's nothing to do with it. Like, it's completely, who knows? Again, like, if you knew that if there was a formula, there would be no point in doing it, right? So it's completely possible to not ever be able to write a poem again, which is like the reason for probably continuing to go back to it. But I would say it almost becomes like a way of thinking. It's not something that I'm in touch with all the time, of course not. Yeah. But it's something that remains like there.
Sure. No, but I guess I'm curious. I mean, for one, I do think that there's, I mean, depending, again, it may depend on the kind of poetry you write. And a lot of your poetry has, at least that I've encountered or that I've read about, there's often a concept involved, or a
process,
premise, a process. It's sort of like, I think of something like your Kim Kardashian book sounded like it was almost like high flarf. Like it was
that thing,
or like
conceptual
different poetry.
Yeah, with a slightly different like intention, like, but it's that ballpark. Yeah,
but it, I think, like, insofar as poetry has some kinship to songwriting, and then on the other hand, some kinship to like joke writing. There is some. I did a Zoom, or listened to a Zoom reading the other day that an old teacher of mine gave, and there were good poems, but like just purely on a technical level, setting aside the overall quality. She's been writing, for some 50 years now, and specifically writes in chiefly in meter and rhyme,
Right.
And just in terms of the grace and the fluency of that, she's able to make the meter and the rhyme feel truly effortless in a way that I think is a matter of refinement over time. Now, that doesn't always correspond to the success of an individual poem or or like the newness or the freshness, but that's a refinement. And I think similarly with like certain kinds of joke telling, there is a polish and a craft that gets developed over time. Then it doesn't always, it needs to be matched to something that's new.
Well, then you have a new problem, right? You might get good at that, and then the problem is that you've got nothing to write about.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I would say that there's always an uncertainty there. Like you might feel like you're confident about crafting a good line or coming up with a good metaphor or something, but that's not going to make a poem.
But so I guess what I'm asking is, do you have are there elements of clearly like craft is not sufficient to account for poetry, but are there elements of that in there for
exactly.
you?
And then for me, it's quite low down the priority list.
Okay.
Like I do respect it, and I do enjoy the sense of a well-honed poem, but I think for me personally, too often it comes at the expense of actually having an idea.
Sure.
Actually delivering something that just doesn't feel like something that I've seen 100 times before. So I guess I do prioritize, to some extent, I want to read something that's for me, reading a poem is that feeling of I don't know what the hell that is. If I'm get excited by a poem, not that it's nonsense,
right?
I know what that is, right?
Yeah.
So it's okay, I'm not sure what's going on here, but it's something's exciting. There's something exciting about it. So in a way, it's trying to find some sort of zone where I'm sure enough of what I'm doing on one level. That might be in terms of I have a way of approaching the idea, or I have something I want to approach. And then there's also an unquantifiable part of it, which is that's the bit I don't know. And that's where the poem is or isn't, right? It's that in that margin. It's if you know it all, if you know what it's going to be before you start, then to me there's not a poem there really. There's you carry out a program, and it's
right. So
it has to be a sense that you don't know if it's going to work. You don't know it, even when you've written it, you don't know if it's worked.
Right.
Something it comes back to this idea of a hidden, or sometimes I just feel like the poem hasn't found all the right context, or it hasn't relinquished its meaning. And sometimes a poem remains in that state for quite a long time, and I think that sometimes is okay. Yeah, it hasn't turned over all the cards yet, if you like.
So something I'm curious about, because I think there are two received criteria for a success in a poem. One of which I think is very in vogue right now, which is the Emily Dickinson. You want to feel like the top of your head's been taken off.
I see,
and that sounds like a little bit like what you're saying about Ashbery, and what you hope to encounter when you read a poem, sort of oh shit, what. But then the other one I'm curious is the Houseman, you want to remember a line the next day and cut yourself shaving. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder what I always wonder with poems like that is definitely you want to have that feeling of initial oh shit, what is going on here? But then what's the second read, or what's where does it go from there? Is kind of
okay. First of all, I'd say I don't really come to a poem with an expectation of what I want either. I'm saying, I guess, because I'm having to think about it in terms of my own writing, what I'm at least interested in, that might not be what I get, but something I'm curious about for me. But also there's plenty of, I also think the taking the top of a head off thing is a trick you can learn, right?
Yeah.
It's the poem that suddenly looks at you at the end, now change your life or whatever, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's also a rhetorical move, which you can learn how to do. There's sometimes also, I think a student said this once, and I was actually, yes. And they said, sometimes I just want to say, yeah, it's a good poem, move on. I feel totally amenable to that.
Right, no one wants to know what your second reading of a joke is. You do.
Yeah, sure, exactly. I think there's room for all sorts of poems.
That was my conversation with Sam Riviere. Again, his book is Dead Souls, available now from Catapult Books. I will have a link in the show notes. Sam also has, as I said, a number of other books. I will try to find a link either to a web page or a publisher's page or something. I believe they are all out from Faber, which always has that really, I find just to be the ideal design for a poetry book, which is solid color, clear, simple serif text, nothing else. So I'm a big fan of that design, and I believe that is all three of his books of poetry, and I'm not sure about his other book of prose. But I hope you enjoyed that conversation, and as always, you can reach me at sleerickets@gmail.com. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.